Welcome inside the Millvale Studios for this week's edition of Geiks Got Game. I'm your host, Matt Geitka, and as always, a joy to be here with you for the next hour, whether you be listening via our podcast page, iTunes, various subscription services, or via YouTube, or even live. We are live on this Friday. It's a somewhat rare occasion that I'm able to get out there at exactly 8 o'clock or close enough to it on Friday morning. Thanks to Pittsburgh's moral compass, Brian Crawford, for running the board today as he just worked an overtime shift. So he's a little strung out, and I'm sure most of you, if you are listening live right now, you're just waking up, getting ready to start your Friday, and a massive sports Friday, in fact. Mostly related to football, but there's still baseball going on despite the eulogies offered up for the Pirates' 2016 season. We will talk football. We will talk baseball. We'll even talk hockey. And we are back around to that side of the sports calendar, but not the NHL in particular. It's the World Cup of hockey that's going on, making it somewhat controversial return. We have some preliminary round games already in the books, including, well, we look forward to, I should say, Wednesday at Consol Energy Center, or at least I look forward to it. I'm excited about it. I'm not going to apologize for that. Crosby and Malkin will both be on the Consol ice a little bit earlier than usual as they'll play each other. Canada versus Russia in a prelim game for the World Cup of Hockey. The entire tournament, the real tournament, is taking place in Canada, but some early exhibition games, exhibition to the exhibition, I suppose you could call it, will be going on. So that'll be a topic of discussion later on in this hour. My expert witness for this week's show is an old, good friend of mine. He's not that old, but we go back at least a couple of years now. His name is Alan Saunders, and he writes for various entities. It's almost a challenge to remember exactly who he doesn't work for at this point. He's a valued commodity in the Pittsburgh sports scene, and not afraid to mix it up and put people in their place on Twitter, which I enjoy very much. He'll be with me in just a few after he gets his daughter on the bus. Yes, school is back in session, and so that is a consideration for Alan, but I appreciate that he's able to take some time out after both he and I were out at PNC Park last night, Thursday evening, to see the Pirates, the zombie Pirates, once again stick a hand out of the grave. They have won 2 in a row after losing 8 straight. So with 20-plus games to play, still technically in this thing, and that'll be something that Alan and I will turn over. But I want to talk football in the first period. Before we get to all that, before I kill the cliche or ban the cliche, sorry, I forgot I'm going nonviolent now with that metaphor, and the final number, that'll be coming up much later on the program on this September 9th, 2016. But it is football time, and even though I would say it's the one sport that I have felt more of a disconnect toward in recent years, I still like the strategy of it. I still enjoy the planning, the game planning, the execution of those plays. In many ways, it's the complete opposite of a sport like baseball, which I cover for a living for DKPittsburghSports.com. In baseball, it all comes down to execution, and I find it a challenge to weave a narrative some nights. Say if the Pirates have a good game offensively, well, there are 8 different hitters doing 8 different things up there, and I'm not counting the pitcher, so I apologize to those fans of pitchers who can hit, and it is enjoyable when that happens. But talking National League ball, and I don't care if it's 8 or 9, one guy is seeing and feeling a totally different thing at the plate compared to the other, and there can be a cohesive team game plan, but there's only so many times that you can write about that before that even gets stale. So in the true team sports, which I will call them, the true team sports like football, like hockey, like basketball, like soccer, like lacrosse, pick it, it's basically more of a team sport than baseball is. You can have that cohesive strategy and that side of things. So it is enjoyable for me to figure out how these individual parts are squeezed together and fit together and molded together by a coaching staff and by team leaders as well to put things in their proper place, or at least try to, offensively, defensively, etc. And I have found this Steelers season, which will begin on Monday with a game in Washington against I'll say the Washington Professional Football Club. Not a fan of their actual nickname, but they're playing out in Landover, Maryland, at FedEx Field. I'm not even sure if that's in Landover, come to think of it, but not in the nation's capital, which is somewhat interesting in and of itself. Could call them the Northern Virginia Professional Football Club or Northern or Southern Maryland Professional Football Club. But that's where the Steelers will be, and I'm sure playing in front of quite a few Steelers fans. That seems to be a spot in this country where there are some expats to the nth degree. Whether you're talking about Capitals games, the Penguins seem to have somewhat of a home ice advantage there, or the rare occasions that the Steelers make a trip out to the Capital District, and even Pirates Nationals, as we saw just after the All-Star break. So it won't be the most hostile of atmospheres. That'll help the Steelers. But I'm having a hard time with this Steelers season, predicting what's going to happen because you have, again, this is deja vu for sure, Le'Veon Bell out for 3 games to start the season. We were looking at a similar scenario last year at this time. Martavis Bryant will not take the field for the Black and Gold this year at all because of piling up marijuana-related incidents with him and failed drug tests. So those are 2 complicating factors for an offense that, as our Dustin Dopirak reported on DK Pittsburgh Sports on Thursday, still has aspirations of scoring 30 points a game. I bought it more last year, but the weapons aren't quite there for the Steelers beyond the quarterback, Ben Roethlisberger, beyond your top wide receiver, and Antonio Brown. You're dealing with quite a bit of inexperience at the tight end position. There's no longer that Heath Miller safety outlet to throw to if you are wearing number 7. He has retired, of course, and full marks to him. Get out while you can still walk, while you can still think if you're a football player. That's always my motto these days, and part of the reason why I mentioned that disconnect has popped up for me with football. Tough to root as much as you do, tough to enjoy as much as you used to when you realize the condition that the sport leaves the players in, and some of the off-the-field stuff that has happened with regard to domestic violence, touchy subject in my household, so, and I'm sure many others on top of that. So that creates that, I guess, half step of disconnect between what used to be a sport very near and dear to my heart. But be that as it may, the Steelers themselves have a disconnect between, I think, their expectations and what the reality will be. And once they get Le'Veon Bell back in Game 4, it'll be good. They'll have some more balance. But at the same time, you're still relying upon second and third class wide receivers. As I mentioned, the tight end position, Ladarius Green, they spent some money on him in the offseason, but it's truly uncertain whether he'll be able to be an above-the-line contributor at all, if you want to use a Mike Tomlinism. So there are plenty of question marks, as we like to say in the sports media business. There's a cliche that I could certainly ban, and I won't be using it for the rest of the show, but there are questions to be answered for the Steelers offense, and defensively too. That's the side of the ball that I would argue has even more to prove. And with Cameron Hayward getting a little beat up in the preseason, more so than the Steelers might like, with Bud Dupree going to miss at least half the season, those are big challenges for the Steelers. Senquez Golston, another injured player, that Liz Frank injury, the whimsically named after Napoleon's battlefield doctor, believe it or not. That's where that comes from. Liz Frank being a midfoot fracture, and something that's very difficult for a dynamic athlete like a football player to come back from. So there are still those issues. There are youngsters in the secondary, even after the trade for Justin Gilbert, the former Cleveland Browns cornerback. He's got a couple of years of experience, but he hasn't done much in this league. I think it all adds up to a team that will be entertaining to watch, but I'm not sure it will be able to beat the Bengals in the AFC North. And that may be sacrilege around here to say something like that. I know the Bengals melted down in the playoffs and basically handed that postseason win to the Steelers last January down at Paul Brown Stadium. But I think the Bengals continue to knock at the door, and they're going to have more cohesion this year, plus the addition of former Pitt wide receiver Tyler Boyd. I think that gives them just enough to get over the top this year and beat the Steelers in the AFC North. And it's been done before. The Bengals have eked out a couple of division titles over the past decade or so, during which the Steelers have also been pretty much a consistent contender, even if they do finish out of the playoffs. So it has been done, but this year is a real opportunity, and one in which the Bengals can get some possible redemption for their utter stupidity. And I don't want to say it comes down to Vontaze Burfict, who will also be suspended. Speaking of Le'Veon Bell being out for the start of the year, he'll be gone. That'll be maybe a blessing for the Bengals, because his brand of passion can too often boil over into a form of recklessness. And you need some of that to play football, and maybe that's what makes him one of the more talented linebackers, one of the more effective linebackers in the league. But when it goes too far, that is when it can be a detriment. And it may not be the worst thing in the world for the Bengals to see a world without Burfict at the start of this season. I think since he's got a real chance, is what I'm saying. I think the Ravens are still rebuilding. The Browns, it's really tough to call for anything positive out in Cleveland, despite their success in both the NBA, the Cavs breaking through for that long sought-after championship in Cleveland, and also the Indians looking like one of the prime contenders for the World Series. That doesn't really carry over at all. That there is maybe some voodoo there to be had on the positive side for the Browns, but I'm not buying into it. And speaking of voodoo and magic and that type of mystical thinking, I think that's the only thing that keeps a lot of people in the sports media, supposedly rational actors, rational analysts, from saying that the Bengals will beat the Steelers, because they still believe in that mental block. And don't get me wrong, I believe in psychological barriers. I believe in, especially in individual sports, I think, where it's just 1v1, tennis, golf. I think there are more opportunities for a player to choke, a player to think about the past and, in effect, sabotage his or her own chances more so than getting beaten by the opposition. In team sports, I believe less in that. You have so much turnover, especially in pro sports these days. Maybe it could be more of a thing at the college level, where you have some repetition of players for 2 or 3 years. In the pros, though, you have, for the most part, a change in roster, a change in many times scheme, if you're talking from a coaching standpoint. Yes, many of the Bengals who have lost to the Steelers over and over again will return this year. It's the same case on the Pittsburgh side. Many of them who have beaten Cincinnati many years in a row will be back. But I think it comes down to talent and execution, as I discussed from the baseball side of it. There is a desire to add all these intangibles in there, but for me, the tangibles dictate more than the things that we cannot see or predict. And you may disagree with me, but I'm more of a give me the facts type of a guy, type of a sports analyst and reporter, and in a lot of ways a sports fan. I've always been one who is drawn more to the logical side, using the left brain, and my left brain tells me that even with all the things that seem to go against the Bengals every year, as we look to the 2016 NFL season, I have a hard time picking against them with all the obstacles that the Steelers have laid before them, whether it be self-inflicted or whether it be simple bad luck. We'll take a step back and bring it on back for the second period of Geiks Got Game. We are talking some baseball and the phenomenon of trying to do two things at once. That's what I think Pirates fans are being tasked with here in September. That's what the Pirates are tasking themselves with. And I'll explain further when we come back after this musical break here on The River's Edge. That's Claymore, Queen of Nightmares, here on this Friday morning. That'll wake you up, as will some iced coffee. Got this iced coffee concentrate from Trader Joe's. And I was skeptical, but I wanted to give it a shot. And we're more toward the end of the iced coffee season, if you will. But so you pour in about a third of the way up the glass. Fill the rest up with water. Bingo, bango. You have instant iced coffee, no brewing needed. So I am not being paid by Trader Joe's to mention that, but I will say it is a fine product. And in my lakefront brewery glass that I picked up from my brewery tour in Milwaukee a couple of weeks ago. So I will not be making that final trip to Milwaukee for the Pirates this month. My boss, Dejan Kovacevic, is taking that from me mercifully, as there is a 10-game trip coming up. I'll be in Philadelphia, 11 games, in fact. I'll take the first date, Philadelphia and Cincinnati. I stumped for Milwaukee last week, and I will continue to do so. I really enjoyed it, and thanks to Lakefront for providing the vehicle to my caffeination on this Friday morning. Yes, there's a sip live on the air. Alan Saunders will be joining me in just a bit. I mentioned he's got some family business to take care of this AM, so I want to give him enough time to pull that off. In the meantime, a quick Pirates segment as we move on to the second period of Gike's Got Game. I am the Gike in Gike's Got Game. No one even calls me that. That was more my dad's nickname, but Gike's Got Game was the name of my column 10 years ago when I was at Marshall University and the sports editor of the Parthenon. So I am happy to revive that name, as goofy as it may sound, kind of based off of the He Got Game paradigm, Ray Allen and Spike Lee and all that from the 90s, which I barely remember, in fact. So that's kind of before my time, but I always liked how that sounded. So we will step away from the football. Pitt, Penn State coming up this weekend, though. That'll be on the docket of topics with Alan in just a bit because he covers Pitt football for Pittsburgh Sports Now. However, I must mention the Zombie Pirates, as I called them in the previous segment. They lose 8 in a row. Their playoff odds drop to 3% after that. And what really hurt was losing 2 to the Cardinals. And what really, really hurt them was losing that second game to the Cardinals this week, in which they carried a 1-run lead into the 9th, and then Tony Watson decided, well, he didn't decide, that would be flipped to say it that way, but it looked like batting practice. 3 home runs for St. Louis, which is pounding the ball this year. Not your typical Cardinals offense, which is contact and runners in motion and all that type of fundamental crap. This is just pure long ball, the way that they are winning this year. Kudos to them, because that is a deep team, and we saw that manifest this week at PNC Park. They took 2 out of 3 to put the Pirates 5.5 games back. Now the deficit is 4 for the Pirates. Behind the Mets, though, because the Cardinals have dropped out. They are not exactly your older cousins or older brothers St. Louis squad this year. Some pitching inconsistencies. And so the offense is carrying them, as the Pirates have tried to pull off this season, too, for much of the year. And it has led to some mediocrity, more than they're used to in St. Louis. But the Pirates are still trailing them and the Mets and the Giants. Those are the 3 teams right there for the 2 wild card spots. They're on the periphery of the race. But they won their second in a row after getting a lovely performance from rookie Trevor Williams in relief, backing up Jamison Tyone on Wednesday. Now that was a true must-win, or as close as it's going to get without being literal this time of the year. So they weren't swept by the Cardinals, the Pirates weren't. And then they take game 1 of this 4-game series against the Reds with Ivan Nova, their thoroughly tepid trade deadline acquisition, which I thought, at this point, I'm betting for one of these pitchers the Pirates do pick up at the deadline to not pan out, but maybe I'm just the stupid one, because I keep thinking, well, eventually the mojo is going to run out. And I say mojo in a completely metaphorical way. There are methods that they have to pick out which players are more likely to succeed in Pittsburgh and what they can do to fix them. And Nova's command has just been spot on since he's come to the Pirates. He has 2 complete games and 7 starts. The complete game doesn't happen at all. And I talked about this in late July when Garrett Cole got his first one in 4 years. It just doesn't happen. And Ivan Nova is getting there in less than 100 pitches, fewer than 100 pitches, to be more grammatically correct. He made it to the finish line in 94, I believe it was, last night, Thursday night. And despite wearing what I believe to be very ugly camo uniforms, it was a pretty performance if you like pitching and if you like efficient pitching and if you like defense too, because I don't know if this is ever going to be proven, but a pitcher who works quickly like Ivan Nova, who keeps the ball in play. He isn't fascist, as Crash Davis once accused Nuke LaLoosh of trying to be in Bull Durham by going for the strikeout. Nova's not about that. He's about efficiency. He wants to get through innings, and he gave the bullpen, which has been reinforced by September call-ups, but he gave that bullpen a needed rest, always needed rest this time of year. If you can get it, if you can get a complete night off, as I said, it doesn't happen these days, and Nova has pulled it off. And he has an ERA of under 2.5 as a Pirate. And you look at his results for strikes, curveball in the zone and out of the zone, big-time improvements. Nova, at age 29, his 7th year in the majors, parts of 7 seasons. So he's heading into his first free agent contract. I'm sure that's a motivation for him. First time on the free agent market. He will get a contract, but of course, nothing is guaranteed. I don't want to say that he's going to get a long-term deal, but it looks like, especially with the skills he is flashing right now, that someone will pay him. And I'll talk about later in the show on the final number what the Pirates might need to do in terms of years. Forget the dollar figure. I think years is the more important thing for a player like Nova, looking for security as much as the long-term payday and an opportunity to win, which David Freese just told me a couple of weeks ago. He feels like the Pirates are as far up there as possible, as far up there as you can be, small market, small revenue, or not. So there are some enticements for Ivan Nova, but there's such a tough deal there for Pirates fans to get connected with a guy who, much like Jay Happ last year, built up his value and left. I think Pirates fans are savvy and smart to expect that the Pirates will be an underdog in trying to re-sign Nova for the coming years. So much like there's a hesitance to get on board with the Pirates this year for varying reasons, whether it be the front office, you feel they didn't reinforce the team enough, whether it be the down years of Andrew McCutchen and Garrett Cole and the dearly departed Francisco Liriano. No, he's not dead. He's just north of the border in the Blue Jays bullpen now. That has created, I think, a sense among the fan base that this is not the Pirates' year. Also, the fact that now they are several games out of it, and it will take quite the September push to even make that last series at St. Louis interesting. You also have this, well, do I want to like Ivan Nova, or do I want to just stay detached and not get hurt? I talked about that last week. That's a real consideration for sports fans. You invest emotionally. Should you invest emotionally in Nova? I can't tell you that, but I can tell you he's been great, and he's one of the reasons why the Pirates are even this close to the playoff field as of right now. We'll take our second break on Geiks Got Game. Abbreviated segment here, but we'll have a long conversation with Alan Saunders of varying sporting outlets. My good friend will join me for hockey talk, baseball talk, football talk, and whatever may pop into our heads on Geiks Got Game when we return from this. We are live from Millvale this morning, and thank you for listening to Geiks Got Game on the September 9th, 2016. And I know my engineer Brian Crawford railed against the unfortunate parts of fall on a recent show in here, which I took part in just briefly before he got into that rant. But I think fall is pretty cool, even though we're technically not there from a meteorological perspective. That's still a couple of weeks away. But you know what? Football has begun. And the man that I have on the line will be at Heinz Field this weekend, not for a Steelers game, mind you, but for what could be the most highly attended sporting event in the history of the city of Pittsburgh, believe it or not. Pitt, Penn State is what I'm talking about. The first time those two, well, I'll put rivals in quotes right now. We'll see how it turns out over the next 4 years, but getting together for the first time since Three Rivers Stadium was a thing, believe it or not. That's 16 years ago now. That was Pitt shutting out Penn State in the what appeared to be the final edition of that rivalry for a while. They're trying to revive it, and I am looking forward to seeing how the turnout is, what the energy is like at Heinz Field, and oh yeah, what the game is like too. And Alan Saunders on the line with me right now, covers Pitt football for Pittsburgh Sports Now, in addition to also covering the Pirates for Pirates Prospects, the Associated Press, and the Beaver County Times. the list goes on and on. Alan, you're a man in demand these days, it seems like.
I'm essentially the literary version of a mercenary.
Jaromir Jagr is your role model.
There you go. There you go.
And I think we could all do well to emulate at least his longevity in his career. Let's turn our talk to football, though, before we talk Pirates, and we also do have some hockey, speaking of Jagr, with the World Cup coming up, and you and I disagree on the merits of that tournament, but I think we both are on the same page in saying this will be a fun Saturday at Heinz. And I know that last week had the emotional touchstone of James Conner returning from Hodgkin's lymphoma, and also that knee injury that no one seems to remember last year too. So a double whammy for Conner. Pitt beats Villanova in a very vanilla game at Heinz Field, but they got the win there. They move on to Penn State, but oh yeah, Alan, Pat Narduzzi decided that he didn't want any of his players to meet with any reporters this week. So how has the week progressed for you? How has your coverage been changed by that decision from Narduzzi to shut things down from a media perspective?
It did change a lot of things. You know, you have, I don't know, maybe peeling back the curtain here a little bit, but most of the time I come into a week having a pretty good idea of what I'm going to write about on each day. But I don't necessarily do a ton of work in advance on those story ideas. I just kind of plan them out. Maybe I'll do some research to find the ones that I think are going to be interesting. But as far as gathering actual materials go, I try to do most of that as close to the time the story is going to run as possible, because you want it to be fresh. You want it to be have the latest information in it. And so when we found out on Monday that we weren't going to have any access to players this week, it was a pretty big deal, because those practice sessions and those player interviews are really our best source of information regarding the team. And so yeah, it definitely changed things. It's not like there still weren't a lot of articles written about the game, but I do think that there was certainly a current Pitt player perspective that was missing. And you mentioned I freelance for the Associated Press. There were, I want to say, 4 stories out of State College this week that the Associated Press picked up. There was one out of Pittsburgh. And the one out of Pittsburgh was about not talking to the media. It wasn't about the team or the game. I think it was Wednesday's Pittsburgh Post-Gazette didn't have a single Pitt article in it. So yeah, it definitely changed everyone's plans. And, I think the reaction to it may have been a bit overblown, but I just think that, Pat Narduzzi has to do what he wants to do for his football team. He's the coach. Things that he thinks need to be done to win games are within his realm, clearly. But just from a PR perspective, I mean, Pitt has struggled for some time to gain relevancy, both regionally when compared to the professional teams, and nationally when compared to more prominent college football teams. And this was like a guaranteed week of wall-to-wall Pitt that they kind of threw away. And I think if you talk to some people at the university off the record, I would say they're probably pretty disappointed in that. And that part of the decision. On the other hand, I think they also very, very badly want to beat Penn State. so it is a bit of a give and take there.
Well, yeah, let's go into that. And I think, right, you and I, you were pretty heated about it, that decision on Monday when we talked at PNC Park. But, if fans aren't terribly bothered by it, then I guess we can move on. And the importance of this game, that's where the logical problem comes into my head with the restriction of media access. Well, if Pat Narduzzi wants to do it this week, then there are more important games in theory coming up, right, for Pitt, or maybe this is the biggest game, even if they go to the ACC championship. I guess if they make a major bowl game, that would be bigger, clearly. But is this already guaranteed to be their most important game of the year from at least, what am I getting at here? Maybe more of a spiritual standpoint, I suppose, as opposed to what could actually be gained in the ACC standings.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit weird. I think this game has so much build up from the Pitt fan perspective that it has almost become a must-win sort of game.
Right. September
just because
11th.
the fallout from losing is going to be massive. And yeah, I mean, it does send the signal that from Pitt that this game is more important than winning big ACC conference games. And maybe perception is reality there. Maybe that's become the case, that this is a game that Pitt feels that Pitt must win. And the other thing is, I guess, I don't know how the other big games on the schedule are at North Carolina, at Miami, at Clemson.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think there's probably something a little bit different about going on the road versus when your game's at home. It just seems, it's not the same when you're talking about the build-up for a game when it's going to be on the road versus going to be at home.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I said September 11th. It's September 10th. That's tomorrow. I'm used to recording the show ahead of time. I added 2 instead of 1. So September 10th might be the most critical game for Pitt, and it feels like a self-fulfilling prophecy at this point. As for the actual game, which will kick off at noon, broadcast on ESPN, Alan, Pitt is favored. Is that anything more than just the home team bump, or do you feel like that the Panthers are the better team at this stage?
No, I think if you line up the talent position by position across the board, Pitt is the more talented team. And I think if you look at what the respective coaching staffs have done, James Franklin's job has been very difficult to evaluate. He's been playing with a short deck of cards because of scholarship sanctions. But so it's a little difficult to say definitively, but it certainly seems like Pat Narduzzi has done a little bit more with what he has in his short time as Pitt's head coach. So yeah, I mean, I think it's more than the home field advantage there for sure. How much more? Maybe a field goal, not a lot. But I think that's where, I think too much can be made of gambling odds as well, because
right.
That's not meant to be an accurate representation of where the teams stand in relation to one another. That's just where they need to put the number to get something resembling even money on either side.
Correct. I didn't mean to insinuate that, but at least one thing you can look at there. So in the aftermath of it, I guess we can look back and see where this one stands up in the history of the battles between these two teams. Going back, first time ever at Heinz Field, first time in this century, I suppose, if you're into that whole thing that 2000 ended the 20th century. Remember that whole controversy? That was interesting. But no matter how you want to put it, a new era of Pitt Penn State, and it begins this weekend. Alan Saunders is my guest. Let's shift over to the Pirates, which Alan covers for countless media outlets, and had you there burning the midnight oil, literally. That is not a cliche in this case, although you weren't burning oil as far as I could tell in the press box. But the zombie Pirates, as I've called them on this show, Alan, they just won't die. They did their best to immolate themselves on a pike with an 8-game losing streak, including 2 to the Cardinals, including that last one, which was particularly devastating for them and their fans. But what are you looking to? What's the story right now for the Pirates, who are 4 games out behind the Mets now, who hold that second wild card spot going into Friday night? I got to say, the schedule is soft, and it's prime for the Pirates to have one more little zombie revival here this season before things finish. But is this team still solvent from your perspective for a postseason appearance, even if it is just one game?
Yeah, I still think so. It's weird. I keep wanting to write them off, and they keep not letting me do that. And I think we've seen some things over the last maybe 5 games to suggest that the offense is in a really good place right now.
Mm-hmm.
They've been stringing hits together. They've been putting balls into the gaps. I think they had 5 doubles last night. Josh Harrison has really taken off at the top of the lineup. Jung-Ho Gong has hit everything he swung at since coming back from the disabled list. And even through that 8-game losing streak, the starting pitching was mostly solid. So if you have solid starting pitching and you can hit the ball, you win more often than not. The teams they're playing aren't particularly good. A lot of them have absolutely nothing to play for.
Right.
So yeah, I kind of do see, and circled at the end of my calendar anyway. One more series with the St. Louis Cardinals, where a sweep could bring them back from even a fairly big deficit at that point.
Right. If it's 3 games, that's all they have to be within to make that final series meaningful, which is September 30th, October 1st, October 2nd. So, pardon the cheap joke, but October baseball is guaranteed for the Pirates this year. Once again, do you still see the starting rotation as being the biggest uncertainty? You and I heard from Clint Hurdle yesterday saying that Drew Hutchison will get a start on Saturday. That is sure to be a touchstone among angry Pirates fans, as he was the lone return in the Liriano deal that also sent out 2 prospects. But Jamison Tyone, in addition to Chad Kuhl getting a breather on Saturday, Jamison Tyone is also sitting down. He's been their most consistent pitcher, I would say, since the start of July, or whenever he came back from the DL, mid-July, I suppose, after the break. So he's taking at least 1 start off. That complicates things, doesn't it?
It does, but I think it's a bit mitigated by the fact that they have a bunch of pitchers that have all done pretty well. Now, obviously, we haven't seen Drew Hutchinson up, but if you look at the other 5 of those 6, however many you want to call it, but I mean, Stephen Brault, who looks like at some point here in the next week is going to end up outside the rotation, has pitched pretty well. Chad Kuhl, outside of 1 short start, has pitched extremely well. Ivan Nova was unhittable Thursday night and has done really well. So, yeah, I still think the starting pitching is the strength of the team. And the other thing I think is they have a serious number of long relief options in the bullpen right now. When you consider Trevor Williams, Tyler Glasnow, Juan Nicasio, Jeff Locke. So Clint Hurdle can, to use one of his expressions, he can manage like his hair's on fire. If a starting pitcher doesn't have it after an inning, okay, go to the next guy.
This is the time of the year to manage as if your hair were on fire. He's been fond of that one for the last couple of days. It's funny how these phrases get thrown around. I think Neil Huntington mentioned pitching like your hair is on fire last month. So, boy, someone call the fire marshal. Some crazy things are going on at PNC Park. You said about Eric Burns. Remember that he played like his hair was on fire. So maybe that's something to aspire to. Gut feel, does that last series at St. Louis mean anything to the Pirates?
Well, I can say it means this. If the Pirates miss the playoffs, that will be the loss with the big gold star, in my mind. As some people would say, the extra inning loss to the Cubs, but you know what? They put up 6 runs against Jake Arrieta. Jeff Locke pitched 2 2/3 scoreless in extra innings. I think the Pirates were kind of playing with house money there. And yeah, it started a losing streak, but that one against the Cardinals, the team that were chasing, to come from behind and get that lead and then lose it at the end, I think that is the one where if they don't make the playoffs, that's the big lost opportunity.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, now for the real discussion. The World Cup of Hockey begins this month. It already has begun with some prelim games. As I mentioned earlier, you're not at all excited about the World Cup. I am. Maybe I'm just desperate for some puck on my television screen, and I will get that over the coming weeks and even a game at Consol Energy Center. I'll be out of town in Philadelphia next week, but if you are in town, you can watch Canada and Russia, in addition to, I think, Team North America, and I forget who they're playing in that opening game. Czech Republic is what it is. So a doubleheader of hockey if you're interested in that international brand. The World Cup, Alan, has been around in the past. It hasn't been played in 12 years, since '04. But what is it about it that isn't making you intrigued about the opportunity to watch some international hockey for the first time since the Sochi Olympics?
Well, a couple things. When the World Cup first started, when it was the Canada Cup, there wasn't a best-on-best tournament at the Olympics.
Okay.
Because the Olympics happened during the NHL season, and NHL players didn't play. And since they've started to allow the NHL players to play in the Olympics and stopping the NHL season, the World Cup has become kind of redundant, and that's why they haven't played it. And I thought there was a good case for ways to make a reborn World Cup interesting. I just don't think they've done it. It's essentially the Olympic tournament with fewer teams, and the players that weren't going to be on a team that are in the NHL that are still good. They just invented teams to find a way to get them in the tournament. There's a Team North America full of under 23-year-old players. There's a Team Rest of Europe besides the Czechs, Russians, Swedes, and Finns. But to me, it just screams like hokey NHL mismanagement and everything that frustrates me about the top league in the sports. And so maybe that's why it doesn't have any of the luster of maybe a tournament like the Olympics does to me. The other thing is it's going to be in the preseason. So it's the point of having best-on-best tournament is to see the best players in the world at the same place and time at their peak. And happening at the beginning of September, you're not going to see them at their peak. You're going to see them like they haven't played, like some of them haven't played hockey since
April,
beginning of April.
Yeah.
So I think those things, and the other thing to me is I think that the reasoning behind the NHL pushing forward with the revival of the World Cup is they're not going to let the players play, or they're going to try to not let the players play at the Pyeongchang Olympics, and I don't like that. I enjoy the ice hockey at the Winter Olympics. I think it's one of the bigger draws at the Winter Olympics, and I think it should stay there.
Fair enough. And the time of the year is different. That's when they held the 2004 World Cup of Hockey, too. But, of course, that was our last bit of pro hockey.
Yeah, at that point, I was all for all the
Right.
other hockey we could fit in.
We knew what was coming. The sword of Damocles was hanging over everyone's head for that full season lockout. So I guess I'm not going to convince you. I like the aspect of the younger players banding up. Like I said last night at PNC to you, that would be cool if there were a team old as well as a team young, and then they could play each other, and we could see whose legs are the fittest. I think we know that already, but I think I would enjoy the veteran guile against the young, sprightly, fresh-faced players. So I admit it's very contrived from that standpoint. The two teams that you mentioned, Team Europe, Team North America, whatever that might mean to a lot of people, it's different. And I misspoke. This isn't the only international action, the first international action since the Olympics. Of course, there's the World Championships every spring, but it's not a true best on best because it's after the NHL season. And of course, teams are still in the playoffs. Players are still in the playoffs from an NHL standpoint. So it's not always the level of competition isn't quite as high as it could be, and that happens every year in April and May.
I'll say this about the World Cup. I did think there was ways to make it interesting. When the tournament.
Yeah, what would you do?
The origins of this tournament were essentially some of the multi-game series between the Canadians and the Soviets, dating back to the 60s and 70s. I think that would be extremely entertaining to pick the top four teams in the world and put them in a 4-team tournament, best of 7 style.
Okay.
Because the Olympics is a 1-game tournament, and but we are used to seeing hockey played at high levels, and you have to win a 7-game series to win. It isn't about winning 1 game. and that would be very interesting to me. So yeah, I think there are ways, and that's just one. I mean, I think there are other ways you could make it still have a tournament featuring the best players in the world, but not the B-side version of the Olympics.
One good way to put it. I would like perhaps a best of 5 tournament. You could do a 4-team bracket. That's one way to look at it. He's got ideas. His name is Alan Saunders, and maybe in future editions of this show, Alan, we can get into our brainstorming to improve baseball, improve the rules of a whole bunch of sports. But baseball, it seems like plenty of room for improvement.
Baseball has plenty of fodder for improvement.
Right.
Yeah.
That's why it's maybe the greatest conversation piece ever invented, because there's so much to it from not just an on-field standpoint, but from a rule book standpoint. That'll have to wait, though. We'll let you go. We will. Well, I'll see you. I don't want to use the plural. I'll see you tonight at PNC Park. And like I mentioned, it's a fun time in the sports year. Football overlaps with baseball. We've got some hockey mixed in. So we've gotten to the other side of summer, and you can follow Alan Saunders on Twitter at @Saunders. That's SAUNDERS_PGH. That's where you can find the list of things that he does, written word. Now doing a podcast, right, with Pittsburgh Sports Now.
Yes. Just we had Tony Dorsett on this week, so
there you go. Wow,
check that out at PittsburghSportsNow.com. It's good stuff.
Perfect. Alan with Dan Kingerski, another good friend of mine. I'll have to try to get on this show at some point. That's Alan. I'm Matt. We'll be back for the final thrilling conclusion of Geiks Got Game this week after this break. Hey, yo, final edition, hope not, final segment of Geiks Got Game. Getting delirious at the end of my hour here with you, and thank you for spending time with us at River's Edge. I say us because it's a 2-man operation. I'm not running the board. That's Brian Crawford back there. Sometimes it's Tom Benoit. That was last week. So radio very seldom is truly a solo venture, even if it is a one-person show. And, of course, it wasn't today. At any rate, Alan Saunders just joined me for a conversation on Pitt, Penn State, Pirates, World Cup of Hockey, which Alan is not plussed about. I'm just excited about seeing hockey. I think I'm really easy to please. That sort of comes down to I'm not the discerning customer or consumer that others may be. I'll sample a lot of things, and I guess I'll try to look for the good, and I'll hunt the good, to use another Clint Hurdleism, and boy, are those tough to get out of your head. They can be cliches at times, and that provides me a smooth segue into Ban the Cliche for this week. And it's a phrase I used in my article last night from PNC Park, unwittingly. Sometimes you're in a hurry, sometimes it's late. I have a whole litany of excuses as to why I can use a cliche and justify its presence, but the elephant in the room is the one that will be barbecued this week. In one way, it's a very vivid bit of imagery, so I'm not opposed to the initial thought that gave birth to this particular hoary cliche, the elephant in the room. I mean, it's obvious. If we were sitting here in this room, which is rather cozy, and there was an elephant in here, it would be tough to move, tough to ignore. And but the one disconnect I've had with that phrase, the bit of confusion I've had with it, is that you talk about ignoring the elephant in the room. I think ignoring the elephant in the room would be almost impossible, right? I don't see a way that you wouldn't be able to bump into it, or it wouldn't make noise, or start stomping around. For me, the better phrase would be, the better metaphor would be something smaller, something more obvious, that is also somewhat able to blend in with the background, and an elephant in the room is not able to do that. So even though we can all convince ourselves, play mind games, and say that obvious things aren't there, or we're just not going to talk about them, and the way I used it was the specter of Ivan Nova pitching well for the Pirates and then leaving. That was something that Jordy Mercer addressed without even being prompted by the stinking media. So kudos to him for being honest. That's why he tends to be one of the more go-to players in that clubhouse for the Pirates, because he tends to shoot straight and isn't afraid to address certain sensitive topics like that. He said that Nova is pitching not just for the Pirates, but also for himself and for his own financial well-being in the future. So I called that the elephant in the room that Mercer addressed, but maybe I can do better and find a way to describe that type of a situation without leaning on something else, standing on someone else's shoulders, as it were. And there's a cliche that I like. That is completely applicable. Elephant in the room, though, is my cliche to ban for the week. Ban the cliche is, as always, brought to you by absolutely nobody. Well, maybe we'll get a sponsor for that. Sponsored segments, we'll work on that. That's the good thing about this show, though. I don't really have to worry about that too much. Brought to you by my annoyed brain. Ban the cliche each and every week. And we'll keep it with Mr. Nova this week. He's the star of the show for my final number. My final number is 3. I think 3 years is, at the very least, what it'll take to bring him back to Pittsburgh. The Pirates were hesitant to give Jay Happ 3 years at what I believe was $13 million apiece last year. That's what he got from the Blue Jays after his scintillating stretch run for Pittsburgh on their way to 98 wins and another wild card berth. The Pirates are on the outside of the postseason picture this year looking in, and if they are going to get there, it's going to be on the shoulders of people like Ivan Nova, who they picked up at the deadline when he was having a very below average season with the Yankees. For whatever reason, he's done better here, better command, better curveball, more first strikes, just getting out of that damned AL East, which can be the hitter's haven that it is very much purported to be. But with Nova at age 29, I think he's going to be hunting at least 3 years, if not 4. And the Pirates have been hesitant to give anyone on the open market more than 2. In fact, if you look at it, the guys they've even signed long-term, they have some option years added to the back of those, even if they are players that are signed to those quote-unquote team-friendly extensions. And there's a cliche I can get rid of and talk about in the future, but the Pirates have extended players like Gregory Polanco, like Francisco Cervelli, like Andrew McCutchen, like Starling Marte. But even there, they have their limits. They haven't gone as far and as deep into the future as, say, the Reds did with Joey Votto. I think he signed a 10-year extension a couple of years back. So they're hesitant there, I think smartly. They're also hesitant, sometimes to a fault, on the free agent market. That's where they are very, very prudent, very, I don't want to say frightened, but I think that's part of it. You don't want to give players money for years in which they will not be productive, and so they've just gone 2, even with Russell Martin. That was all that Russell got. He was devalued at the time, but he ended up being a very valuable player for the Pirates in his 2013 and 14 seasons. For Nova, after what he's done, even though he has been rather average for most of his career, started the season in the Yankees bullpen, in fact, but with what he's done, with the demand for starting pitching, with this pitching market in the offseason looking like it'll be one of the more sparse in recent seasons, the Pirates are going to have to stretch to 3 years to bring him back. Whether they want to do that or not, we're not privy to that type of thinking, but that's what I believe it will take. Forget the money, and it'll take more than $10 million a year, clearly, to get a Nova back into the fold for 2017 and beyond. But if the Pirates want him for years 30, 31, and maybe even 32 if they're aggressive, it'll take 3 years guaranteed, and not 3 years with an option being that third year. And that is my final number for this week. Thank you for turning out in numbers for the River's Edge. We have had some great weeks, an awesome August. Thanks to our growing palette of content, talk content, also local music. We are your voice for local music in addition to local talk. It is a new kind of radio. I like to think that Gike's Got Game every week is a new kind of sports talk too. And thank you for helping me believe that by listening, by watching each and every Friday at 8 a.m. I'll be back with you next week, shorter edition from On the Road, as I'll be covering the Pirates in Philadelphia and Cincinnati, the final long trip of the season before that short one to St. Louis at the end of the year. You can follow me on Twitter at Matt Gajtka, MattGajtka. I'm on Facebook at Matt Gajtka Sports Media, and most of my content is found at dkpittsburghsports.com, which you can subscribe to for as little as $150 a month if you sign up for our 3-year plan. There's that number again, 3. Good way to wrap up the show. This is Matt reminding you that when the radio fades, you know life's moving fast. God bless, and I'll talk to you next week once again on a Friday.